Our first speaker today gave me permission to not say her surname. So this is Kate. You can also call her Treno, which is what she's called at work. And she's going to talk about a message that I imagine as a parent would be terrible to hear, which is your child has been in an accident. Thank you, Kate.
For many years, my experience caring for injured children and their families took place in the emergency department. So the initial minutes and hours after injury, and alongside my ED colleagues, I've cared for injured children across the spectrum, from the minor to the major. And it was probably in that resus team environment where we worked together to stabilise the critically injured infant, child or teen, I felt the greatest degree of accomplishment. Returning from PICU or theatre after we dropped off these children and families, and really in hindsight, just thinking we've achieved our core purpose to assess, resuscitate and stabilise, and never really considering, perhaps through some degree of self-preservation, what the next steps might look like for that child and their family. Of course, for some of these families, as they left our emergency department, their journey after injury was only just beginning. For some, this may involve multiple procedures and operations, prolonged inpatient admission, and ongoing follow-up and intervention after discharge. For some, lifelong impacts, physical, emotional, and psychosocial. And while this journey is different for every child, young person, and family, the one thing they all have in common is the abrupt disruption that can occur after injury. 3 years ago, I stepped into this post-injury world when I joined our trauma service as a nurse navigator. And shortly after, I met Jace and his family. But this wasn't what Jace looked like when I first met him. This is what Jace looked like when I first met him. He'd come off his dirt bike the previous day, sustaining multiple injuries. And his initial operative management included damage control orthopaedics, so he had X-Fix applied to his pelvis, femur, tibia. He had a laparotomy, a colostomy was formed, and he also had interventional radiology to stop internal bleeding. Needless to say, this was the beginning of a very long journey for Jace and his family, and I'll return to their story a little later. In the initial aftermath of injury, families can experience a real sense of loss of control and unpredictability as they try to comprehend the impact of their child's injury, which at that point in time may include potential loss of limb or life. And they may meet multiple teams and individuals as they place their trust and the care of their child in our hands. And tension can arise as they try to balance caring for their hospitalised child whilst also meeting the demands of life and family needs outside of hospital. And then on top of this can be further compounded by the nature of the injury and if family members were involved in or witnessed the incident. These injuries occur in a split second, but the subsequent guilt or blame that may be experienced by some caregivers can endure. This may arise from a parent feeling directly responsible for their child's injury or attributing blame as they try to construct meaning as to how and why it occurred. The parent whose back was turned when their toddler pulled a freshly boiled kettle over them, or driving the car that resulted in the motor vehicle accident involving their children, or reversing the car out of the driveway only to run over their unseen child. They may blame themselves for not fulfilling what they see as their parental role to protect and keep their child safe. One study found that half of parents of injured children express responsibility either for their own actions or that of another family member that resulted in their child's injury, and subsequently described intense guilt. And guilt and blame attribution can actually impact caregiver adjustment and adaptation after injury, as there is a known relationship between psychological response patterns between parents and children. So if parents have this guilt, that affects their coping and adjustment, that can then in turn impact the child because of that pattern of psychological response after accidental injury. Children and young people are reliant on their families, particularly their primary caregivers, to meet their physical, emotional and social needs. And parents play a pivotal role in their child's post-injury recovery, with that known correlation between parent and child's psychological well-being. So for example, parental anxiety and acute psychological distress has actually been found to influence child procedural coping and distress behaviours after injury. And then on the flip side, increased parental resilience, coping and capacity strengthens their ability to positively support their child, which makes total sense, right? So a key buffer to support the child during their recovery trajectory should focus on parental support. It's estimated that up to 80% of hospitalised children and their caregivers will experience at least one symptom of acute stress responses after injury. So for the child or young person, these will vary based on their age and developmental level, but may include emotional distress, behavioural disturbances, separation anxiety, developmental regression, sleep disturbances, or like arousal or avoidance type behaviours. Caregivers may experience some of those symptoms, or perhaps a newfound hypervigilance in caring for their child. Most children and caregivers are resilient, and symptoms will dissipate quickly or over the first few weeks after injury. For some, recovery will take longer, but symptoms will in time return to baseline. However, for a smaller group, symptoms will persist, becoming chronic, and will not improve without the input of specialist mental health support. And on top of this, post-traumatic stress symptoms have been found to significantly predict quality of life outcomes after injury. As early as the 1940s, this concept of quality of life was first included as one of the basic principles in the World Health Organization's constitution through this statement. And then with advances in trauma care and improved survival rates in the 20th century, the quality of life sequelae of traumatic injury began to appear. So some of these being the invisible injuries. There's a variety of definitions and measures that exist to quantify the quality of life impacts on physical, emotional and social functioning. But what appears consistent is the increasing awareness that early identification and support of the quality of life impacts and potential post-traumatic stress will improve outcomes for the children, young people and families we're caring for. So how do we predict? How do we anticipate which child, young person or caregiver is at risk of enduring post-traumatic stress or quality of life impacts? In my organisation, we have a trauma family support service, and it's made up of trauma nurse navigators, I'm one of them, and our social worker. And our role is to provide care coordination and psychosocial support to the injured child and family for up to 2 years after injury, or beyond, if needed. However, inclusion criteria for that follow-up is predominantly based on injury severity score. So that's an international scoring system used to calculate and describe overall injury severity. However, injury severity has actually been found to be quite a poor predictor of post-traumatic stress in children, and there's variable evidence on the relationship between injury severity and parental distress. So what that means is just because a child or a young person has a major or multi-traumatic injury doesn't necessarily mean they or the caregiver will do poorly. And you may have a child who has a more minor or moderate injury and lower injury severity score, but they and their caregiver can still encounter challenges. Subjective injury experience and perceived threat to life may be more powerful predictors, or pre-existing parental mental health and pre-morbid child behaviours in combination have also been found to predict recovery patterns in children and parents after injury. So for me, as an ED nurse, stepping into this post-injury world beyond the doors of ED, I was trying to concoct the perfect formula to predict which of our children and families were most in need of our support. But what has become clear to me is, whilst I do believe it's important to hold an awareness of some of those known risk factors, there are also so many variables in every child and family story that there is no such thing as the perfect predictive formula. So instead, taking that knowledge, that's supporting the caregiver to optimise their capacity and adjustment after injury, will in turn support the child and the entire family unit, essentially to buffer them against the anticipated challenges after injury. The overarching way to do so is to integrate responsive, trauma-informed care into standard practice. And I'll be honest, I used to think this concept of trauma-informed care was somewhat of a buzzword or a gimmick, something that just should be occurring naturally and inherently in our practice. But what I've come to find is, unfortunately, I don't think that's always the case. We work in a unique, fast-paced environment that often presents challenges of multiple competing priorities. And as healthcare providers, we play such a vital role in minimising the potential impact of exposure to potentially stressful or traumatic events. And if we can adopt a conscious and consistent practice of embedding these trauma-informed care principles in our everyday care, we really can make such a difference. So what is trauma-informed care? Essentially, by integrating an understanding of medical traumatic stress in our routine interactions with children and families, we can actually change how those children and families cope with and respond to emotional reactions to illness and injury. And there's a number of strategies we can apply when practicing trauma-informed care. One of the biggest buffers and protective factors for families after injury is clear, consistent communication from their healthcare teams. This is, in my opinion, one of the most powerful tools we have access to that can make the biggest difference on supporting families after that disruption after injury. Injury and hospitalisation causes disruption and potential feelings of loss of control in these families' lives. But by investing time to ensure understanding of planned clinical management plans and expectations at each time point will help to reduce stress and increase coping capacity. And that can be tricky, particularly in that acute phase when the long-term impacts of injury are still evolving and there may still be uncertainty, but still just taking that little bit of time to find a space, listen, ask and assess understanding, and discuss questions or concerns really can be a profound buffer against the impact of injury. Our social work team are worth their weight in gold in providing support and psychological first aid to families as they navigate that disruption after injury. For the most part, psychological repercussions after an injury are a normal response to an unexpected situation, but some children and family members may require additional specialist mental health support either during hospitalisation or in the community after discharge. I think if we can just hold that awareness that some of the children and families we're caring for may need that additional support, it can make such a difference to identify awareness for the family, possibly facilitate referrals to that specialist support, be that social psychology or follow up with their GP in the community with a mental health care. Can you still hear me? I do prefer a microphone actually, so this is great. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. As part of an evaluation of our trauma family support service, we undertook some interviews with carers followed up by our service. And this concept of connection resounded as a theme from a number of families. So connection to the hospital and ongoing relationships to hospital staff provided comfort to families as they navigated injury recovery. And this appears consistent with qualitative studies that have explored experiences and needs of families after injury who have felt cared for and not alone in their journey. This connection and progressive follow-up provides reassurance that their child is on track or guidance in accessing that additional support if needed. However, this connection is resource dependent. So what do we do if we have finite or no such resource? Knowledge and anticipatory guidance will also strengthen parent adaptation, again normalising reactions and feelings. Awareness that the varying emotions that they are experiencing or behaviours their child may be demonstrating are likely an expected response to injury and likely to improve with time and support. but also awareness on the potential psychosocial impacts of injury over time, and guidance to access that additional specialist support to mitigate that impact if needed for their child or themselves. So ideally building in this knowledge into routine discharge education and planning. There's a number of resources and websites that are readily available. Here are a few that I've found particularly helpful, and ideally would be offered to every family impacted by injury. Some are injury specific, others address medical trauma, and others focus more broadly on mental health and well-being for children, young people and families. It really is the family stories and their shared experiences that has taught me so much. Who better to gain insight into the challenges and the resilient factors than those who have lived it day in and day out? Walking beside these families during some of their darkest and most uncertain times, but also having the opportunity to witness their incredible progress and post-traumatic growth. I reached out to some families who are now further into their journey after injury and was so humbled by their generosity and their willingness to share their story. They said if their story could help other families or healthcare providers in any way, they would be more than happy to do so. So this is just a little insight into their story and some of the things that help them to navigate the disruption after injury. So Jace, he's almost 3 years post-injury now. He underwent a total of 11 operations and he has another planned surgery this year. When I asked his parents what they found helpful after his injury, they identified a few things. During hospitalisation, keeping a journal to record Jace's cares, management plan and next steps from his treating team, and also creating a timetable to help coordinate his multiple team reviews helped for the family to regain a little bit of routine and control. After discharge, having a central point of connection to the hospital through our trauma service and also ongoing support from our trauma social worker. Also endeavouring to normalise things even a little by merging a bit of their outside world when Jace was in hospital for those initial weeks. So an example of this is captured in that last photo that shows when we organised for Jace's dentist to attend hospital to adjust his braces. And it was probably one of the first smiles I saw on Jace's face when he pulled back the sheets to proudly display his pelvic X-Fix to his dentist. For Jace, with extensive rehabilitation and goal setting from his treating and allied health teams, he worked towards independence and his goals, one of which was to ride his bike again, perhaps with a little initial trepidation from me and his mother. But he is riding his bike again. He's now in year 10 at school, and there he's there in his Macca's uniform where he works on the weekends. This is Sienna. Sienna was 11 years old when she was injured in a quad bike accident. She was impaled by a tree branch, which resulted in hemorrhagic shock and an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And despite 2 subsequent cardiac arrests into hospital, she received life-saving treatment by our team at Hervey Bay Hospital before her retrieval to us. Sienna received over 100 units of blood products, and during the acute phase of her injury, her family actually set up a campaign to donate blood back home in their hometown. They described the helplessness that they experienced during this acute phase of Sienna's injury and identified this campaign. It helped them to some extent to combat that helplessness, also to provide a purpose, a much wanted distraction, and also an avenue to connect with friends and their family and home community as well. Sienna and her family started to focus on the small wins and setting short and long-term goals. She was always an avid netball player, so whilst still attached to her parental nutrition, once she discovered that hoop at the hospital, she continued to regain her strength. Her family have described the ups and downs of the last 2 years, particularly for Sienna, in managing disappointments when her injury has hindered her from where she wanted to be or things she wanted to achieve. However, continuing to focus on return to sports and long-term goals has helped. And that last photo was taken this year at the Queensland State Age Championships. So that's Sienna there in the red bib. And finally, this is Arlo. Arlo was 5 years old when he was injured when his father accidentally reversed a ride-on lawnmower over his leg, resulting in the need for a below-knee amputation. This was understandably a very challenging time for Arlo's parents as they came to terms with his injuries. but their resilience and their support for one another has been profound. And as Arlo has continued to show such incredible progress, so too have his parents. And there has certainly been no stopping this young man. He is an avid fan of the Hulk, and here you can see him proudly displaying his Hulk prosthetic leg. He's riding his bike again, and his new favourite party trick is to climb doorways. Every family story is unique, and injury will present inevitable challenges in some degree at some stage. The invisible injuries that may bubble to the surface over time. We may only be present for a chapter of these family stories, but I believe we have a unique opportunity as healthcare providers to buffer against the impact of injury if we intersect with these families at any point in the injury recovery. The overarching buffer is to apply trauma-informed care into every single aspect of our care. When we're doing our assessments, undertaking a procedure, during our clinical rounds or an outpatient consult, creating that little bit of time and space to promote adaptive coping and strengthen resilience during the acute phase of injury and beyond. Communication and informed decision making, providing resources and education material to support expectations, normalise responses and thresholds for additional support if needed. Together, these buffers ultimately will facilitate a positive adjustment and wellbeing after injury. Thank you.